Good evening, and once again, this is John Carpenter for AGS10 News, covering the primaries and caucuses in Nevada, Michigan, and South Carolina. Right now, we have the Republican results for Nevada. Now, this was, at one point, a caucus, which was proportional. Now it's a winner-take-all primary. Doug Butcher wins it with 40% over Kyle Fitzgerald at 32%, and that means with 31 delegates for Doug Butcher. Michigan's results are also in at this hour. The Democrats don't hold their primary until October 31st. Kyle Fitzgerald, the expected winner, at 44%, followed by 35% with Doug Butcher. Stephen Hamilton trails at 21%. Michigan has an interesting split where 45 delegates are directed by winner-take-all and 15 proportionally. That's leaving Kyle Fitzgerald with 52, Doug Butcher with 5, and Stephen Hamilton with 3 delegates. These are not surprising results. We're still waiting for South Carolina. South Carolina has not yet reported their results, but we do have some information from the Democratic primaries. Democrats were holding a caucus in Nevada and a primary in South Carolina, and we've got now another close finish between Arguello and Marshall, but this time Charles Marshall comes up on top with 34.7% of the caucus delegations, 34.4% for Matthew Arguello, 16% for Vince Paskey, and Matthew Jones with 15%. That leaves a delegate count in Nevada of Marshall 9, Arguello 9, Paskey 3, and Jones 3. This is a very interesting development where we've seen a back and forth between Charles Marshall and Matthew Arguello in these very, very tight races. Finally, we now have results from South Carolina for both the Republican and the Democratic side. We're going to be showing you the Republican side first. With 100% reporting, Doug Butcher wins the South Carolina primary. It's a winner-take-all primary over Kyle Fitzgerald at 40%. Stephen Hamilton lagging far back at 18%. Because it's winner-take-all, Butcher takes 47 delegates. 100% reporting on the Democratic side. We've got Charles Marshall with 42% over Matthew Arguello with 35%, Vince Paskey trailing with 16%, and Matthew Jones at 6%. Proportional, 15% being the threshold. Charles Marshall racks up 20 delegates, Matthew Arguello 17, and Vince Paskey with 8. Now, if we want to look at some of the trends that have been emerging and the reasons why certain candidates have been successful in some of these primaries and other candidates have not been so successful, we take a look at what's been happening on the ground and what's been happening in the air. If we look at South Carolina, for example, we see that Fitzgerald, compared to Butcher, spent an awful lot more time campaigning in South Carolina. And the relative bases were pretty much the same. Butcher was appealing to a lot of moderates, Fitzgerald was appealing to a lot of conservatives, and in fact even Stephen Hamilton had a fairly large base in South Carolina to begin with as well. The big difference and the big factor in this was momentum. With wins in Iowa, wins in New Hampshire, Doug Butcher had a lot of national momentum going for him. Even more than that, he outspent Kyle Fitzgerald both in ads and in the ground game, and had the endorsement of Mark Sanford, the South Carolina governor. All of these represented a shift in the balance from the very heavy on the ground campaigning Fitzgerald to the air war where Doug Butcher was dominating. This allowed for a very close squeaker win. Another factor, of course, in South Carolina was that Stephen Hamilton had basically written off the primary. With a fairly large base, a lot of his supporters did in fact go over to Doug Butcher. On the Democratic side, we look at Charles Marshall being very, very heavily concentrated campaigning versus Matthew Arguello by a more than 2-to-1 ratio. Matthew Jones just spent a little bit of time there. We also look at the reason why it was maybe a bit closer than it should have been, because Charles Marshall did spend a lot more time. Again, it's the ads and it's going to be the ground game. Matthew Arguello was the first person into South Carolina, and he had a lot of support coming in from foot soldiers. Not a heck of a lot compared to, let's say, the Republican side, but he did have more foot soldiers than Charles Marshall. He also had a very strong ad game. He had a lot of print ads that came out and some radio ads that came out, and that kept it a lot closer than it properly would have been had they spent about the same amount of time and the same amount of money in South Carolina. When we look at Nevada, we see again a very large base for Doug Butcher to start with, a smaller base for Kyle Fitzgerald, and again a fairly large base for Stephen Hamilton, another state that's been written off by his campaign, leading to again supporters moving over to Doug Butcher. Not a lot was spent in ads or foot soldiers for Nevada. It was a very plain Jane state. Not a lot of people from the Republican side even went there. When we look at the Democratic side, it was a more heavily contested result, pretty much even between Arguello and Marshall when it came to the amount of campaigning that was done. Actually, Matthew Jones spent almost twice as amount of his time campaigning compared to Arguello or Marshall, which is why this is one of the first states that he's won delegates. The big story here was the decline in momentum for Vince Patzke, especially without just not being on the trail at all and not getting any national exposure. He found his numbers going really down. He had more base support coming into the contest in Nevada, but ended up with only 15%. When you look at the ads, Matthew Arguello dominating in ads. Foot soldiers, a lot more even when it came to the amount of time spent. But Charles Marshall had a lot of momentum from the Iowa win, from the very close New Hampshire win going into Nevada. That eked him out a win as well. Finally, when we look at Michigan on the Republican side, not a lot to say here. Doug Butcher basically wrote off the state. Stephen Hamilton wrote off the state, allowing for Kyle Fitzgerald to rack up a fairly sizable win. If we look at the base support, Fitzgerald and Butcher pretty much had even going into this, but with Jose Portela on the side of Kyle Fitzgerald, it may not have been the smartest move if Doug Butcher had decided to go into this state, because he would be at a significant disadvantage.